This is interesting because, recently Jiang Zemin, the former leader of China who started the persecution, he died. And sort of since Xi Jinping came to power, he's been in this power struggle with Jiang Zemin and a political faction tied to him. He's sort of been dismantling their power base. But it seems like, even with Jiang Zemin dead, the persecution is still continuing.
Yeah, I think discerning the political maneuverings of the CCP is an enigma wrapped in witchcraft. In terms of the complexity of who's on whose side and who's backstabbing someone today and backstabbing someone different tomorrow, the factional definitions and the allegiances are complicated. We certainly don't understand all of them. But one of the things we know for sure is Jiang Zemin's faction was for a long time quite powerful. I think he elevated more generals in a year or two than the entire term of his predecessor. He put together, it was interesting, the senior researcher over at Freedom House, her name's Sarah Cook, she describes it as basically a mafia. And that is, you elevate people based on their ability to go out and commit horrendous crimes. That's how you rise through the ranks. And
you mean the generals weren't being promoted for all the wars China was successfully fighting?
Yeah, exactly. And so that was they were building up the Jiang Zemin faction was being built on its willingness to get blood on their hands. And once you've done that, I would imagine, you take off the original leader, Jiang Zemin, you still have all these people that he elevated that were the drivers of the persecution, that have tremendous amount of blood on their hands. And that is going to be a certain impetus to keep the persecution going, certainly try and keep the lid on it so that the details of everything they've done don't come out. And I think that's because of the culpability of that group and that huge faction. That's what's really driving things today.
Well, I guess I would imagine even people not in that political faction necessarily, since Falun Gong is such an existential threat to the Chinese Communist Party as a whole, they really can't be like, hey, whoopsie, sorry about that.
Didn't mean it.
Yeah, there's no way to back down.
Yeah. And I think that's right. And I think that really happened, going back to sort of these three stages. The first one was justification. The second one was cover up. Once the amount of atrocities got to a certain point, it was sort of like, we got to cover this up because if this gets out, we all go down.
Well, maybe if you just keep doing more atrocities, eventually it'll go away.
Let's hope not.
Well,
let's hope so, right?
Well, let's hope
well, no, we don't want it to stop because they have successfully atrocityed everyone to death.
I see.
Okay,
that's the distinction. But no, this ties back into what we were saying at the beginning. Like, the effects of this persecution in China are being felt here in the United States, where our own government is, to a greater or lesser degree, being controlled by the Chinese Communist Party to silence voices, persecute people, Chinese students at school, which affects every student at a school. So this is having a real impact in the United States.
For sure. And I think, I would venture to say it's reasonable that sort of culpability sort of vortex that Jiang Zemin created doesn't entirely stop at China's border. In terms of the influence that he had around the world, did he pull others into that? I'm sure there are cases of that. And so, I think that sort of the blood on the hands phenomenon is to some extent felt around the world.
Well, I think the CCP just feels like they can do it around the world, and that they're like, if you look at the way the Hong Kong national security law was written, the one that got passed in 2020 to stop those protests, one of the things I find fascinating about that is that the jurisdiction is not limited to Hong Kong or China. It's global jurisdiction. So if you commit a national security crime anywhere in the world, they consider that under their jurisdiction, and they can't arrest you in America. But if you go to China, they could arrest you, or Hong Kong, they could arrest you. So to me, it's that mentality of global jurisdiction that is revealed in the Hong Kong national security law, that kind of like when you look at this DOJ indictment, right, against these two guys who were basically acting like foreign agents, but the CCP feels justified in doing that, like almost like legally or morally justified in their global jurisdiction.
Yeah, I think there's been sort of a slow, I don't want to call it a waking up, but I think the CCP has been caught unawares at various stages of this whole thing. I remember when the persecution first started, they brought a senior official, like 4 days after the persecution started, they got a senior official on Ted Koppel's Nightline. And they asked him point blank, why are you doing this to Falun Gong? At that point, tens of thousands of people are being rounded up around the country. And he was sort of like, they're disturbing social order and disrupting traffic. And Ted Koppel was like, what? That's the best you could do? And so I don't think they were used to the idea that they'd have to explain themselves to the international community. And there were several stages of this. Several years after that, suddenly their officials are starting to be served with papers being sued in international jurisdiction courts for their crimes against Falun Gong. That was a big wake-up call. And so I think you're right. There is a mentality in the CCP that they can kind of do what they want, such as bribe an IRS official, and they're getting some pushback from civilized society that says, no, you can't do that.
I mean, I get why they think that. Consider that after the Tiananmen Square massacre that same month, the Bush administration sent a secret delegation to China to assure Chinese leaders that it wasn't going to get in the way of doing business with China.
Yeah.
So they have every reason to believe they can have global jurisdiction and that the U.S. won't fight back.
Yep. And I think that was why, coming back to the Uyghur question, after the U.S. government has officially designated as a genocide, if you go to any major bank, U.S. bank, they still have their webpage on China boasting about all the business that they're doing in China, business as usual. And I think to a certain extent, the CCP understands that and knows that. So unfortunately, contrary to what I said earlier, I think there is a good amount of examples where they're not getting the pushback. And so they still have that attitude.
Why do you think the persecution of Falun Gong hasn't been labeled a genocide?
I think it has to do with the CCP's perception of Falun Gong as an existential threat, and therefore the extent to which they have gone to pressure foreign governments not to do such a thing. But also, I think we can't minimize the amount of work they've done to silence it in Western press, or in some cases even sort of inject their narrative into some of the Western press, which makes the Falun Gong issue in the eyes of policymakers and decision makers in the West not seem like that big of a deal. I haven't read about it, hasn't been in the headlines. So what do you mean call it a genocide? I think they've been rather unfortunately effective at keeping the news of exactly the scope and scale of what happens to Falun Gong out of the news. And that means people are not as informed and not as motivated to do that kind of thing. It's been somewhat effective.
I think I read in the media that all Falun Gong are far-right Trump supporters.
Yes, or anarchists, or, there's been all kinds of stuff.
I mean, those are two like pretty separate ends of the spectrum, right?
Exactly. I mean, I read in the paper, this is interesting. I read in the paper that actually Falun Gong, I didn't know this, we're racist. We don't allow interracial marriage. And so, I was reading that and I turned to my wife, who's of a different race, and I said, honey, I don't know if we're allowed to be married because we both practice Falun Gong and we're not of the same race. So, that was another thing I had learned recently.
It's always good to believe everything you read in the papers.
Yeah, exactly.